Welcome to episode number 37 of the MMA Rundown podcast. There were no fights this weekend. There aren't going to be any fights next weekend, so I'd imagine that this is going to be one of the quicker episodes that I've done. But with that being said, I still got a handful of things to talk about. So there's going to be 7 topics. First one is going to be Conor McGregor giving an interview, which is the first one I've seen from him in a while. It was given to the Mac Life, which is a website that he owns. He also had his coach John Kavanagh also give an interview to the Mac Life. So I'll talk about what I saw in that interview and if there's anything to read into it. Then there was a story about Justin Gaethje, where in an interview with Brett Okamoto, Dana White said that Justin Gaethje had been turning down a handful of fights, and a lot of people were upset about that. They felt like Gaethje was being blackballed and that he really deserved a title fight. So I'll talk about what Dana White said, what the reactions were, and then what Justin Gaethje said in response. Then I've got a couple recaps from some wrestling tournaments that happened over the week. So there was the end of Midlands. So in last week's podcast, I talked about the first couple of rounds of Midlands. So at least here, I'll recap the final results. Same for Southern Scuffle. This one I didn't really talk about at all in the last podcast because it hadn't happened yet. This one I'll probably just look more at the finals and like the draws as a whole because it wasn't as deep of a tournament as it used to be. Also talk about a few fights that were just announced. So a big one that seems like it's on the verge of getting signed is going to be Demian Maia versus Gilbert Burns. And then there are a handful of smaller fights that I'll mention those as well. And the last thing to talk about is going to be PFL completing their 2019 season. Just talking about how that went and how I feel that they're going to go from here as far as a business. I feel like with them, they're spending a lot of money on these fighters. Obviously, on that event, they had 6 different $1 million winners. So the question is, are they going to be able to make enough money to actually make up for all the costs? Because they definitely have high costs. The question for them is going to be, is the revenue enough to make up for it and still end up walking away with a profit? But back to topic one, and that's going to be Conor McGregor and his interview. So, first off, as it's pretty obvious here because it was with the Mac Life, this interview was fairly well staged. What was interesting to me was to see how Conor McGregor, what he decided to say, how long the interview went, what questions were asked, how he responded to them. One of the first things that stands out is that the interview takes place seemingly right after he got off the mat during a training session. Like he's just covered in sweat, sort of like fighting through some breathing, just trying to like catch his breath. But as the interview goes on, he starts to calm down and get into his element a little bit more. So the first question would be, why is this interview taking place right after he got off the mat? My best guess to that would be that he's trying to make it look as though he's just working so hard in this camp. Let's be honest, like even if you're working your ass off, if you're training your ass off, you might be training 6 hours a day, which is absurd. There's still 18 other hours in that day though. Like you don't have to have the interview the second you get off the mat. Like for him to do that, it's obvious that he was trying to send a message there that he's working hard. I guess to some they'll see that and they'll be like, oh wow, look at Conor, he's just working so hard, and the only free time he had was between rounds. But to me, that was more of a staging thing where he's like, let's make sure I'm really sweaty and breathing heavy while we're doing this, just so people know that I'm working really hard here. So I thought that was kind of weird, and in a way, having him in that space sort of limited the quotability of it because I think at times he's a little bit more entertaining when he has more time to prepare and kind of get in the right mindset. Whereas there, I don't think he was in the right mindset right away. One of the other interesting things that stood out to me though is that in terms of MMA, he fought in 2016 against Eddie Alvarez. He fought again in 2018. It's now 2020 right now. Granted, the year just started, but you would imagine for most fighters they're going to improve over that period of time. Just to make it overly simplified, if you think about it like in video game standards, like if he was a 92 overall back in 2016, you'd figure that at least like in the skills areas, he'd probably be like a 94 or 95 by now. And a lot of what he was saying wasn't like, I feel like I'm better than I had been in the past. A lot of what he was saying was, I feel like I'm back to the fighter I was. And to me, that's interesting. The fighter he was obviously an excellent fighter. The fighter he was a lightweight champion. So if what he's saying is true, and oftentimes people will say they're better than they are, you always hear the, oh, this is the best camp of my life thing. If he actually is at that level, that's still pretty exciting. But to me, it's a little bit alarming that a guy like him who oftentimes talks himself up isn't even saying that he's better than he used to be, saying I'm back to what I used to be, and that's a little odd to me. But even still, like I mentioned, what he used to be was still a great fighter, and if we get the Conor that beat Eddie Alvarez, there's a decent chance that Conor is going to be just fine right now. So that remains to be seen. We'll see how the fight goes, and I guess from there, obviously, that'll go a long way in determining what he's going to do next. If he loses to Cowboy Cerrone, it's going to be a big problem for him. I don't know what kind of matchup you would want to give him after that. Given that Cowboy it's about as easy of a fight as you can give him if you're going to give him a highly ranked lightweight. Like, lightweight's a super deep division, so there's no such thing as an easy fight in that division if you're pulling a ranked fighter. Even if you're going outside the top 15, like, there's still plenty of hard fights there. But if you're going to say, okay, well, of the top 15, who do we think Conor matches up the best with? Cowboy's got to be the number one there. So he's getting that chance right now, but if he loses this match, I just don't know where he goes from here. It looks like he has absolutely no desire to go back to 45. And if he loses, at least with 45, you'll be like, okay, well, that's where the majority of his great achievements came. So you can make that argument, but I don't see 45 being on the table at all. So for him, he's got to win this fight, or else it's going to be big problems for him, and I don't really see where he goes from there. But if he wins, obviously, he's got all kinds of choices. He has Masvidal. He could potentially run it back with Diaz if he wanted to. He could fight with Gaethje, which is one thing he mentioned in that interview. He could also try to wait for Khabib, given how big of a fight that's going to be. Decent chance that fight gets made. So it remains to be seen where they go from there. But to me, I think where I'm going to leave it is I'll just leave it at this. Next weekend or next week's podcast will be a week ahead of the fight, so I think I'll do a more in-depth preview then. So just briefly mention Justin Gaethje. I'll go back to Gaethje again. For Justin Gaethje, as I mentioned starting off, there was an interview where Dana White said that he was turning down a handful of fights. People were reacting negatively to it, saying, well, it looks like Gaethje got screwed out of a title fight because he was turning down some fights and acting in his best interest. It's worth mentioning to that response. The guy who has a title fight right now is Tony Ferguson. Tony Ferguson is a whole lot more deserving of a title fight right now than Justin Gaethje is. Gaethje's on a 3-fight winning streak. Yes, they were all first-round knockouts, and generally when you get quick finishes, it tends to be a little bit more impactful than just getting the wins. But with that being said, it's not as though his resume is even close to that of Tony Ferguson. So I don't have any problem with the UFC putting Tony Ferguson in there for a title fight. It sounds as though from Justin Gaethje's standpoint, he doesn't really have a huge problem with it either. I think he understands that Ferguson was the guy, but for him, the reason why he was turning down fights is because with Ferguson, at times he can be unwilling to take fights because he doesn't feel the money's right. Other times he can be unwilling to take fights because he has other things going on. There was that mental health issue that happened earlier in the year that took him out of that interim title fight that ended up being Holloway and Poirier. So I understand why Gaethje was saying, hey, let's hang on, let's see what happens with this title picture. I'm probably option B, and if option A falls through, then I want to be available. So it doesn't seem like there's anything too bad there. So I'm going to play what Justin Gaethje had to say right now, and then I'll give my response to that. Vikings just won. So it's taking a little bit to pull it up here, but the audio should be coming up at some point now. I don't know why it's not coming. Here we go.
Yeah, I've been trying to figure out what he's talking about. I know when he did the interview not too long ago, when he kept saying Justin Gaethje knows what I'm talking, or what's going on. He knows what's happening. I literally had no idea what he was talking about. So it was pretty crazy. But I was just thinking about it with my dad, talking about it with my dad, and I'm pretty sure it was they offered me Tony Ferguson when Tony Ferguson fought Cowboy in June. And they were looking for a replacement for that fight in May, at the beginning of May. And I told them that, that wasn't enough time. But if they pushed it back a little bit farther, I would take that fight. So then they turned out giving that fight to Cowboy. That happened. And then they asked me if I wanted to fight Tony on Abu Dhabi card. And I said yes. And he said no. And then so I took the Cowboy fight the week after that. And then just recently, I believe he offered me Charles Oliveira in Brazil or Dan Hooker in New Zealand, all while the champion did not have a fight and McGregor was coming back and still looking for a fight. As far as I know, that's what the deal is. I don't know.
Have you spoken with Dana since he's made these comments directly? And if not, when will you? What are you gonna say?
Oh, I've never ever really had maybe one time in my life. I don't have his number. He doesn't have my number, so I'm not sure. I have a good manager. All we have to do is when he said that, I called him right away. I was like, dude, what is he talking about? What did I do? For one, I know I hadn't done anything wrong, but as far as I don't know. I don't think he has people above him. Dana White, this is the money business. He has people above him that are telling him that he needs to put this fight together because it's going to make the most money. I'm sure. I'm only from just looking from the outside in. So yeah, I'm guessing that's why he's saying these things. I don't think he's necessarily trying to make me look bad. I've done everything that man could ever want from a fighter or an employee or someone that he pays money to. or pays money to watch. So I don't know. I don't think he's necessarily personal against me. I think it's, again, people above him tell him that he needs to make that fight happen no matter what. I'm here. They move me above him in the rankings, so it helps me a little bit when it comes to politics, a little bit better of an argument. And so that's where I'm at right now.
Yeah, so that was Justin Gaethje's response. That was on an interview with Sirius XM Fight Nation, or Sirius, I think MMA Tonight was the show. But that was about 2.5 minutes of him just responding to that. And again, kind of like I mentioned before, what he's saying is that he thought he was option B, so he wanted to remain available, and that's part of the reason why he didn't take the Dan Hooker fight or take the Charles Oliveira fight. So from Justin Gaethje's standpoint, I understand why he did what he did, because he is option B for a title fight. Why tie yourself up with a fight if option A is a little inconsistent and might end up backing out or not being available? So I don't see an issue with what Justin Gaethje said. I can understand from the UFC standpoint where if they're thinking you're not the guy we're looking at for the title fight right now, we're offering you another fight. Why aren't you taking it? I can understand where they're a little bit frustrated there. But to me, I don't think the UFC is doing anything all too wrong here by offering him other fights and being upset that he's not taking them. I don't think Justin Gaethje is doing anything wrong by saying, hey, look, I want to make sure that everything's cleared up before I take another fight. So to me, no harm, no foul there. One other thing that is worth mentioning, though, and I think that's going to piss a lot of people off, because it feels like with MMA fans, there's kind of like this assumption, and it really showed with this Justin Gaethje story, is that people just kind of assume that Justin Gaethje is like a rightful title contender right now, coming off of the last 3 wins he's had. People also assume that Conor McGregor doesn't deserve to be anywhere near a title. Justin Gaethje's had 6 fights in the UFC, so we'll look at his last 6 fights, and then we'll look at Conor McGregor's last 6 fights. If you compare both in their resumes, Gaethje's resume is win over Michael Johnson, win over James Vick, win over Edson Barboza, and win over Donald Cerrone. If Conor McGregor wins this fight over Donald Cerrone, his last 6 would be win over Cerrone, win over Diaz, loss against Diaz, loss against Khabib, win over Alvarez, and then win over Aldo. I would actually argue that Conor's resume is a better resume there than Justin Gaethje's is. Now, granted, with Gaethje, at least he's strung 3 wins together, and with Gaethje, at least he's been fighting in the division. He's actually had to make 155 before these fights. The wins that he's had have also been early finishes, which can be helpful. Granted, he did get finished by Alvarez, who McGregor put away and just absolutely dominated. He also lost to Poirier, who McGregor a long time ago also was able to beat convincingly. So I'm not saying that if McGregor wins this fight against Cowboy that I hope that he jumps over Gaethje. But with that being said, if he does, it's not as though there isn't an argument to be made that on merit McGregor could potentially deserve it more than Gaethje. I know it's going to make a lot of people annoyed, and they're going to feel like Gaethje deserves it without a doubt more so than McGregor does. But if you do look at the recent fights and compare them, it's not as big of a gap as people would expect. I think a lot of people just think that Justin Gaethje's done way more to earn a title fight than Conor McGregor has. Not necessarily the case, and obviously McGregor's a bigger draw. Now, granted, do I think that's the next fight they're going to make? I don't know about that. McGregor's been talking about a handful of other guys. He's been talking about Gaethje. He's been talking about fighting Masvidal. Even throwing out Usman's name there, which is kind of weird. So it's not as though Conor McGregor is going to be begging for that fight. Plus, we have to see what happens in April. If Khabib fights Tony Ferguson and Khabib wins, I would have a harder time seeing the Conor McGregor fight being made just because McGregor only had 1 win since losing by finish to Khabib. So I think at that point, there'd be a better case to be made for Justin Gaethje to get that title fight because, for one, you wouldn't be throwing Conor back in right away. But then for 2, there's an argument that Justin Gaethje matches up very well with Khabib because he's a Division I All-American, so he can be difficult for Khabib to take down and should definitely have an edge on the feet. So the lightweight title picture is going to be pretty messy, and it's going to be messy for a while, especially with the title fight not being until April. But if Conor McGregor does get the win over Cowboy and does slide in ahead of Justin Gaethje, don't be surprised if the argument that I just made for you is an argument you start hearing from people like Dana White as well. But now moving on to wrestling, we've got the Midlands Championship. So I had gone all the way through to the quarterfinals when I was doing my recap on the last podcast, and that was before. So I'll start at 125. So at that point, it looked as though Spence Lee was going to win 125 pounds, and he was just running through everybody. Unfortunately, though, next day comes along, that's Sunday, and he medical forfeits. It's not clear what the issue was there. He just forfeited out the whole day, so that could have been a weight cutting issue. He could have been sick and not able to make the weight. I don't think he's a big 125er, so I'm not sure what the deal was for him, but whatever the case may be, he ended up having to pull out of the tournament then. So Mike D'Agostino from Northwestern ends up going straight to the finals. On the bottom half of the draw, you had Brock Hudkins from Indiana versus Pat Glory from Princeton. Looked as though Hudkins was very close to winning this match in overtime, but in a scramble where he was trying to come up on top and almost had neutral danger on Pat Glory, his knee, Hudkins' knee, as it was trying to get passed across, it ends up popping. So it looks as though his season's probably over there, but the match was definitely over, so he ends up losing by medical default. Then as a result, Glory moves on to the finals and beats D'Agostino. So at 133, though, this was where the Sunday semifinals were really exciting because there were great matches. I guess in the top half, the Austin DeSanto match, you kind of figured DeSanto would win pretty easily there, and he did. But on the bottom half is where it got really interesting, and that was with Sebastian Rivera and Seth Gross. Rivera dominated the takedowns here, but while he was on top of Gross, while he was trying to maintain a ride, Gross was able to kind of lull him in and toss him onto his back. So he got 6 points, 2 for reversal, 4 for back exposure, and that put him in the lead. And he was able to do just enough to hang on and avoid getting taken down one more time to give up his lead. But some people felt as though the refs gave Gross way too much time to hang on into stalemated positions, and as a result, Rivera ends up losing here. But you would think, after watching this match, that if the next match goes anything like this one does, that Rivera's probably going to get revenge on Gross. So then they go to the finals between Austin DeSanto and Seth Gross. Unlike the first match where Gross wasn't close to taking DeSanto down at any point, this time he was a lot more aggressive, was able to take him down quickly, got him in a cradle, looked like he might have had a chance to pin him, but DeSanto got out quickly, but was already down 4-0, 2 from the takedown, 2 from the cradle. Eventually escapes, is down 4-1. And then from there starts to gain some momentum. But unfortunately for him, Gross was just up by too much, and eventually Gross ends up winning by a score of 6-5 with DeSanto trying to finish a takedown in the final seconds to steal the win away. At 141, Max Murin from the University of Iowa was the number 1 seed. He wrestled to his seed and was able to win this tournament. Ends up facing Josh Heil in the finals after Heil got a win over Tristan Moran of Wisconsin, beats him by a score of 5-3. At 149, on the top half, you had Austin O'Connor, the number 1 seed in the nation and the number 1 seed in the tournament, having to go through 3 straight Hawkeyes. Barely gets by Jaron Glosser, a backup where he was down 5-3. Glosser gets a point taken away for stalling, and then in the final seconds gets taken down for another 2. So that 2-point lead is erased immediately and turns into a 1-point deficit, and O'Connor's able to hang on and win. In the semifinals, O'Connor then beat Vince Turk by a score of 3-1. But then in the finals, facing Pat Lugo, was beaten by Pat Lugo by a score of 8-4, and Lugo looked a lot better than O'Connor did in this match. O'Connor is coming back from an injury, but he just didn't look very strong in this tournament, and definitely not against Lugo, who's now going to be the number 1 seed in the country at 149. At 157, Iowa had Caleb Young coming into the season where he had a pretty strong finish to the end of last year, where he ended up finishing top 5 in the country as an All-American. But has had a bit of a rough start. Started 2-2. Granted, the 2 losses were against very good wrestlers. He lost to David Carr, and then he lost to Quincy Monday of Princeton. Monday was in this bracket, but he got knocked off pretty quickly. Ended up wrestling his way all the way back to 3rd. The guy who beat him, a backup, no less, from Army, actually made it all the way to the finals, Marcus Hartman, before falling to Caleb Young, where Young was able to get a win there. Young also had to beat Kendall Coleman of Purdue to get to the finals. Ended up winning in overtime by pin, although it was more of a takedown, where the pin was just kind of given up when Hartman knew that he had given up the takedown. So for Caleb Young, sort of solidifies that he is one of the top guys in the country, even after a rough 2-2 start. So much needed victory for him. At 165, sort of a 3-horse race. The main horse was Alex Marinelli. He didn't have too many difficult matches to deal with on the top half of the bracket. But on the bottom half, you had Evan Wick and David McFadden. So obviously the winner there is going to have to face him. Both of them have wins over Marinelli, though Marinelli also has wins over them. McFadden ends up getting through with a late takedown against Wick, then faces off against Marinelli in the finals. And Marinelli gets 2 takedowns to 0 in that match and ends up winning by a final score of 5-3. At 174, unfortunately for Iowa, as I mentioned last week, Michael Kemmerer wasn't able to make it into this tournament. So instead, Dylan Leidy from Purdue, who's been having a fantastic season so far, already won CKLV, has a strong run all the way to the finals, where he has to face against Bryce Steyert from UNI, and then Leidy's able to win that match by a score of 3-2. So Leidy now, I believe, is 20-0. I think is still ranked 4 in the nation, although it's sort of a tough one because you know he's not ahead of Mark Hall. You can't put him ahead of Hall yet. He's going to actually have to beat Hall to get ahead of him. He hasn't faced Cutler. And then Kemmerer hasn't been at 174 before prior to this year. He's looked good so far. He hasn't had the wins that Leidy has had. So you can make an argument that Leidy at least deserves for now to be the number 4 guy or the number 3 guy in the nation. But I think he's still number 4 behind Kemmerer. But that's a match that I'm sure will happen sometime soon, whether that's at Big Tens. Maybe it happens at NCAAs. I don't know if they have a duel against each other, but if they do, that match is definitely going down there. 184 was a mess for Iowa. In some ways it was good, in some ways it was bad. So it was good in that their redshirt freshman made it all the way to the finals in Abasad. The problem there is that they don't really want to pull him from redshirt this year. But this is also a year where Iowa's trying to go for the title, so you want to put your best foot forward. Abasad had the strongest finish of all the Iowa guys, but you also had Cash Wilkie in there, and you also had Nelson Brands, who was the number 2 seed headed into the tournament. Brands, as the 2 seed in the quarterfinals, fell to Zach Braunagel of Illinois. After that, Braunagel went to the semifinals and got pinned by Abasad. Braunagel also lost in the third place match to Cash Wilkie, who beat Nelson Brands in the consolation bracket. So it's hard to argue that Nelson Brands should be the guy at 184 right now after this tournament. Cash Wilkie, of the guys who are on the active roster, definitely has the best case, given that he lost one match but then wrestled all the way back to third. Abasad finished second, so he didn't lose until the finals, until he lost to Taylor Luan of UNI. But if you're the Hawkeyes, I think at this point you probably have to go with Cash Wilkie. I don't think that Abasad did enough to show that that you can count on him being so much better than Cash Wilkie that it's worth burning a year of his red shirt. He also is one of those guys where after watching him at this tournament, you feel like the Abasad we're getting next year is going to be a lot better than the Abasad we have this year. That there's a lot of room for improvement, and that there's a lot of reason to believe that he can be great. So I don't think it's the best idea to use him right now. I think Wilkie, based on this result, is going to be the guy for Iowa. But obviously there are a lot of matches left to be wrestled. If Wilkie starts to struggle or starts losing some matches in duels, I'm sure you'll see Nelson Brands again. Maybe even see Abasad if they feel like neither Brands or Wilkie are up to snuff. But you were hoping for some clarity at 184 for Iowa out of this tournament, and you really didn't end up getting it. 197, Jacob Warner was the number 1 seed heading into this after beating Pat Brucky, the number 2 seed, in a duel in Princeton. Didn't really go all that well for him, though. He looked decent heading into the semifinals, but then in the semifinal match against Aiello, had a decent lead, but got reversed twice, which is kind of uncommon for him. He's a very good rider. So that wasn't going well for him. But even still, he had a lead late in the match and wasn't able to hang on, got gassed, and Aiello was able to get the win there. Meanwhile, in the bottom half of the draw, Christian Brunner was able to beat Pat Brucky by a score of 4-3, and then Brunner would beat Aiello by a score of 7-3 in the finals. On the back draw, Warner would end up losing to Brucky, I believe by a score of 10-5. So he got taken down 4 times and got 0 takedowns, which is a lot different than what we saw in that Princeton meet. So not a great look for Warner. And then at 285, this went very well for Iowa. So their freshman heavyweight, Anthony Cassiope, was able to just kind of run through everyone, get to the finals, and then beat Matt Stencil, who's a really solid wrestler from Central Michigan, really good pinner. So for Cassiope, great finish there. He ends up winning it all. For the Southern Scuffle, at 125, the winner there was Nick Piccinini from Oklahoma State. Not a big surprise there, although he was pretty close to getting knocked off earlier in the tournament. I believe it was Latona of Virginia Tech who was pretty close to finishing him there, or to beating him there. At 133, just trying to get this to load a little quicker. Number 1 seed head in was Mickey Philippi, but he ended up losing to Sammy Alvarez of Rutgers. And then he would end up beating Sakura of North Dakota State in the finals. So coming in the 5 seed ends up winning the whole thing. So pretty good for Rutgers to have their backup 133 pounder, really, given that this spot normally would be going to Nick Soriano. They should definitely be happy about that. 141 finals, you had Kane Gefeller versus Real Woods. Gefeller from Oklahoma State, Woods from Stanford, and Woods was able to get the win here by a score of 6-1. Gefeller looked pretty good prior to that, but he even got a pin over Kyle Shoup, but Woods just dominated him in this match. 149, we have the number 1 seed in Raquir Vandermeer. He ended up losing to the number 8 seed, Milner from App State. But this ended up being a battle of highly touted freshman Andrew Alirez, who was able to get all the way to the finals, and then Jaden Abbas, who was unseeded in this for Stanford. So you end up having Alirez versus Abbas in the finals, and Abbas was able to get a win by a score of 3-2. And Alirez, I think, had a really strong performance as a high schooler in a big freestyle tournament where he's going up against some former NCAA champions and was actually beating them. So for him, he's a guy that a lot of people are looking at right now as a guy who you could expect to make it to All-American status, if not better, this year. But given that he's a freshman, he has a lot to prove, so you can't really rank him as that yet. You still have to see him do it in in college wrestling. At 157, number 1 seed was Hayden Hadley, and he wrestled to a seed, ran through pretty much everyone, beat Jesse Della Vecchia in the finals by a major decision, score of 10-0. At 165, just trying to get this to load a little quicker. You had Griffith from Stanford. Wasn't super dominant in the final 2 matches, but looked pretty good prior to that. But was able to beat Travis Whitlake by a score of 4-1 in the semis, and then beat Schedule from Navy in the finals by a score of 2-1. So did enough to win there. A few more weights to look at. 174 is the next one. So in the finals there, we had Harvey from Pitt versus Starocki from Penn State. Starocki, I think, is going to be redshirting this year, but he had a really strong tournament as the number 6 seed heading in, but had a handful of majors in the finals, was able to win by a score of 11-6. So definitely something that Penn State should be happy about, especially with Mark Hall being towards the end of his career. At 184, Trent Hadley made it all the way to the finals, had a rematch with Louis Duprez. Hadley had beaten Duprez prior, I believe that was at Cliff Keen, but Duprez was able to get that win back this year, or in this tournament, so he won by a score of 3-2. At 197, Dakota Gear was the number 1 seed. He got knocked off in the quarterfinals. So in the finals, we ended up getting Adams from West Virginia, and then Nathan Traxler from Stanford, and Adams from West Virginia was able to get the win by a pin. So he ends up winning the entire thing. And then at heavyweight, the final bracket here at the Southern Scuffle, number 1 seed was Demetrius Thomas from Pitt. He ends up getting knocked off in the semifinals by Robertson of UNCO. I'm not exactly sure what that is. But then Robertson faced off against Gannon Gremmel of Iowa State and was beaten in the finals. So those are all your results from the Southern Scuffle. Back to some MMA news. We've got a fight that is brewing between Demian Maia and Gilbert Burns. That one is scheduled for the Brazil event in March. It's supposed to be a co-main event. I don't think it's official yet, but it looks as though everything's set to go there. Gilbert Burns has talked about this fight in the past as though it's one that he definitely wants to take, so I don't think there's any issue on his side signing it. Looks like the UFC is interested in making it, so I don't think there's any issue on their end. So the only question would be, why would Demian Maia not want it? And it seems as though Maia's cool with taking it, and in a way, it's a little bit similar to a match he's had in the past, where there was that match with him and Gunnar Nelson. Now, granted, Gilbert Burns has accomplished more in jiu-jitsu than Gunnar Nelson has. Not to say that Gunnar Nelson hasn't done impressive things, he definitely has, but Burns has accomplished a little bit more. Burns, I would imagine, is a little bit smaller than Gunnar is, though, and also going to be smaller than Demian Maia. But again, he's still a very high level, so the question is going to be, how's this fight going to go down? Is it going to be like that Gunnar Nelson versus Demian Maia fight, where the fight does go to the mat and whoever the better jiu-jitsu guy is ends up winning those exchanges, which you would assume would be Demian Maia, not to say that it's going to be easy for him if he does. Or is it going to be mostly a stand-up fight, where you have Gilbert Burns, who's just this stocky, powerful guy, throws a lot of heavy shots. Is he going to keep Maia off of him? And then just try to make it a stand-up fight and just try to knock him out from there. That's another option for him too. So to me, this is going to be a real interesting fight, just in terms of how they're going to go about it. Whether you have Gilbert Burns, who definitely views himself as one of the best jiu-jitsu guys in the world, whether he's going to be like, you know what, I don't care if you take me down, like, go for it. Or maybe he'll think he wants to take Demian Maia down and feel as though he can dominate from top without getting caught in anything. It'll be interesting to see how these guys approach the fight. With Maia, you pretty much can assume how he's going to approach any fight. But how Gilbert Burns is going to want to approach this fight in particular is going to be interesting. And if it ends up being a stand-up fight, at least it'd be a better stand-up fight than the Ben Askren versus Demian Maia fight. But if it ends up going to the ground, you could see some really high-level jiu-jitsu down there, given that you have two former world champions down there. So definitely an exciting fight, and one that I hope is made, and one that I hope actually we see through to the end and no one gets injured or has to pull out. A couple other fights to mention that just got announced. There's Ion Kutalaba versus Magomed Ankalaev. So Ankalaev's that guy who's one of the better touted Russian prospects. Had one of the better performances on that UFC Russia card. I think it was Dalcha Lungiambala that he was fighting, where he had that front kick to the face knockout. So he'll be fighting against Kutalaba, who just had a really brutal knockout of Kolo Rountree. Rountree now is looking at retiring after his next fight against Sam Alvey. So that fight's going to be a very interesting one to watch. There's Marcin Tybura versus Sergey Spivak. So Spivak had that impressive win over Tai Tuivasa, where he was able to wrestle him, beat him up, and eventually finish him on the not Tuivasa, Tybura. Decent striking. It's been a guy who's been hanging around like the 10 to 15 range at heavyweight for a while now. So for him, it'll be a good test for Spivak. We'll see where Spivak's at. I know with heavyweight being such a shallow division, when you see a guy like Spivak who can take guys down and beat them up, you definitely feel like that kind of skill set can go pretty far in the division. So here he'll have an opportunity to test himself against a guy who's sort of in that 10 to 15 range. We'll see where Spivak lays, and if Tybura gets a win there, then maybe he can kind of use that and try to build up some momentum and try to work his way back up towards the top. And the last one to mention is going to be Mike Davis versus Giga Chikadze. So both of these guys are guys who we've seen on prelim cards. Both of them are pretty impressive. Chikadze, he can wrestle, but he's shown some pretty good striking as well. Davis, a bit more of a striker from what I've seen so far. So this will probably be another one of those exciting fights where you feel like the winner potentially could find themselves on a main card sometime soon and facing off against a guy who a lot of fans are more familiar with and have a chance to really prove themselves and start to work their way into a position where they're getting close to getting ranked and maybe even get ranked after that. And then the last thing to talk about is going to be the PFL. So they had their final event of the year. This was basically the Super Bowl of the PFL. If you look at how they're structured throughout the year, they have like a season, and they have the playoffs, and then they have the finals. So this was the finals. So this is basically like the Super Bowl of the PFL, the Stanley Cup Finals of the PFL, NBA Finals of the PFL, World Series of the PFL, whatever you want to call it. Wasn't able to find any information on their gate numbers, so I don't know how many people came. I don't know how much money was made off of that. I don't know what the ticket prices were necessarily. So it would have been good to know at least what their ticket revenue was. Again, we do know that they had 6 different $1 million winners. The payouts, I think, were over $7 million. If you look at what the losers were getting paid as well, and that's before you look at all the other costs involved in running a show at MSG on New Year's Eve. So their costs are definitely very high. The ratings on it, I think, was 360,000 on ESPN Plus, which isn't bad for an MMA show. But if you consider the fact this is their premier, their biggest MMA show, it's got their biggest stars on it, and that's what they pulled. Not the best sign. Again, they're paying a lot of money. They are signing some guys. I think they signed Johnny Case. They signed Roy McDonald. Obviously, McDonald's the big one. So at least for fighters, they're getting paid in the meantime. There's a lot of money being thrown at them. But the question is for the PFL, are they making their money back enough to where they're at least like breaking even, if not actually like making money? If you're a business, the idea is to make money, and if you're not, you're not going to last a whole lot longer. And to me, that's my main concern with the PFL is that if you're a fighter and you can make good money in the PFL, it looks like the checks are clearing right now. I don't blame you for going there. I don't blame you for making your money. But if your hope is that that's going to be a long-term place for you to stay and you're going to continue to make money over the years, I don't know that I would really look at it that way. To me, it looks like most of the money that the PFL is getting, it's not money from customers. It's not like ESPN or a distributor is paying them that money so they can show their fights. It's not as though fans are just throwing a bunch of money at them so they can watch the fights. It looks like a lot of the money that's being used to pay for these fighters and pay a lot more than some other places are willing to pay these guys because, quite frankly, these fighters aren't pulling enough to be worth the money they're being paid. It's coming from the PFL management making a case to some high value investors saying, hey, look, we just saw the UFC sell for $4 billion. We're a premier MMA league as well. Put some money in with us. Look at how successful the UFC was. Imagine what you could do with us. And I think that if you're not a big MMA fan and you're not following this closely, that might seem like a decent pitch to you. But to me, it looks like a lot of these investors are going to be out of a lot of money. They're going to be really unhappy because I'm just not seeing where the PFL is going to be making enough money on top line revenue to actually be sustainable and to actually be able to function without constantly having to pull more money out of investors. And you can only do that for so long. So for them, they're really going to need to be pulling in better numbers. They're going to need to be drawing in a lot of money on live gates to make up for the fact that they're paying as much as they are for these fighters. It's great to see fighters get paid a lot of money, but you have to be able to survive as a business. Otherwise, though it can be nice for a fighter to make X amount in 2020, if around 2021 they're going to have to look elsewhere, and that can be a problem for them. So for the fighters who made $1 million, great for them. But there's a reason why a lot of promotions pay fighters the way they do right now, and that's because this is an entertainment business. You got to pay based on what the fighters are able to bring in. You can think that a fighter has worked their ass off and they're worth $1 million, but if you put that fighter on and you're not making more than $100,000 when they're coming out there, like you're going to be out of business really quickly. So an example I used in podcast 36 was talking about how they were really digging deep into Kayla Harrison and really picking her as a future star. And again, that's another example where it's like putting Kayla Harrison on the top of the card. Again, she was on top of this card. 360,000 people watched it. That's not fantastic numbers for your premier event. This is her biggest fight to date. You're pulling 360,000 with a bunch of other $1 million fights on there. Like, for an individual MMA event, sounds decent, but that's your Super Bowl. That's not great numbers. There's always room for improvement. You would imagine that if they can continue to gain some traction, they'll improve. But for as much as they're spending, they got to improve really fast, and I don't see any reason to believe they're going to. So for the PFL, as long as they can keep suckering investors in and stay alive and keep the runway going, I mean, good for them. I guess they'll survive. They survived longer than I expected them to, but I just don't see them being successful with the model they have and really sticking around for a whole lot longer. Great for the fighters who can take advantage of it right now. Great for the fighters who can make their $1 million paychecks right now. But for the promotion itself and for the promotion's well-being, and again, if there's no promotion, then these fighters aren't getting paid and they're going to go elsewhere. You'd like to see them having business practices that are a little bit more effective, and I'm concerned that what they're doing right now isn't going to last very long. So that'll cover it for episode 37. Episode 38, still haven't decided whether or not I'm going to release that one early, or how I'm going to go about that. Like I mentioned before, I'll be out of town. I'll be in Las Vegas for the whole weekend. So I guess if you're subscribed, you'll get a notification, or you might have to sign up for notifications as well. If you're subscribed to the podcast, which I highly recommend, then obviously it'll just feed right into your podcast feed once it's out. So if you're expecting the podcast on Sunday, maybe check back a little earlier. It might come out on Thursday. If you're expecting it on Thursday, again, it pays to be subscribed, because at least then you'll know when it's available. And by pays, you're not actually having to pay anything. It's free, so might as well. So that covers it for this week, and I'll be back next.